In the last video, we looked at how to organize our numerical data into 5 classes to create a frequency distribution table. So the frequency distribution table is this part right here. But now we're going to take a look at how to translate this table into a graph that's called a histogram. So I'm going to create that histogram below, and I'll show you how to create this histogram by hand. And then in a later video, I'll show you how to create it using StatCrunch, which is a part of your Pearson MyLab statistics software. So here, what we're going to do to create the histogram is we're going to figure out how to make our number line on the x-axis here, which represents the number of credits completed. Okay, and on the vertical axis here, we'll plot the frequency. Okay, so this is the frequency, which we can see goes from 0 to 15. Okay, so 0 here. And again, my drawing is not perfect, but I'll try and make it as nice as I can. So I'll just skip count here by 5. So 5, 10, 15, 20, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so the hardest thing for students to do by hand is to determine what that x-axis labeling is going to be. So to do this, the first thing that we're going to do is calculate what's called a midpoint. So to calculate the midpoint, what you're going to do is you're going to figure out what is the value, right, that is exactly between the highest class limit, so the upper class limit, and the lower class limit of each class. So what's exactly between 9 and 31? So to calculate a midpoint, all you do is you add up the two numbers, 31 plus 9, and then you divide by 2, and that gives you the midpoint, or the value in the middle. So that's 20. And I can mark that on my histogram. So on my histogram here, I can mark 20, my first midpoint, okay? And then you just keep going and doing that for each class. So 54 plus 32, divide by 2. That gives me a midpoint of 43. And again, keep going. The next midpoint is 66, 89, and then 112, okay? So I can mark this on my number line. So I'll skip count by every 3 squares here. So that'll be 43, 66, 89, and then 112, okay? All right, also notice that the difference between each class's midpoint, so if I take 43 and subtract 20, notice the difference is my class width. So again, if I subtract each, you'll see that the difference is 23, and it's consistent all the way through. The class width is going to be 23. Okay, so the distance between each midpoint on my histogram is going to have a width of 23. So once we have the midpoint, then the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to create boundaries. And what I mean by boundaries is you're going to create lower boundaries that bound each of your classes, and then you're going to create an upper bound, which bounds the upper part of your class. And the reason why we want to create these boundaries is because we want to have markings on our number line where if a student completes 9 credit hours, I can mark that frequency. So how many observations do I observe where students completed 9 credit hours? I can mark it and have it fall in between my lower class boundary and upper class boundary. So I don't want it to fall on a boundary, okay? So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to start with our second class, okay? So to create the lower bound, I'm going to start with my second class here, 32 to 54 credit hours, and I'm going to figure out what is the midpoint between my second upper class limit and my first class's upper class limit. Okay, so what's exactly between 31 and 32? And you don't need to do the math here. You can just use your head. Between 31 and 32, what's exactly in between it is 31 and a half. Okay, but if you're not sure how I calculated that, that's just 31 plus 32 divided by 2. And then we continue on. So I keep going. What's exactly between 54 and 55? That's going to be my next lower class boundary. So that's going to be 54 and a half. Okay, and then again, you keep going. What's exactly between 77 and 78? Well, that's 77 and a half. And then what's exactly between 100 and 101? Well, that is going to be 100.5. Okay, and so now to figure out what the lowest class boundary is for the first class, what you're going to do is you're going to use your class width. So if we, and again, you can check, notice that the class width, let me see if I can use a different color here. I'm going to use purple. Notice that the class width, the difference between each lower class boundary and the next lower class boundary, has a width of 23. So 54.5 minus 31.5 is 23. And again, this difference is 23. This difference is 23. So the difference between the first lower class boundary and the second lower class boundary should also be 23. So what I can do here is I can just take 31.5, subtract 23 from it, and that's going to give me 8.5, which is going to be the lower class boundary for that first class. So notice that 8.5 bounds students who completed 9 credit hours. 31.5 bounds students who have completed 32 credit hours, and so on, and so on, and so on. And so then now, to create your upper class boundary, the upper class boundary is going to be based on the lower class boundary. So when we create this number line here on the histogram, we want to make sure that our class boundaries is continuous and there's no overlapping or gaps, okay? Or there are no gaps. And so to do this, what you're going to do is you're going to take the lower, so the lower class boundary for the second class becomes the upper class boundary for the first class. So this is going to go from 8.5 to 31.5. And notice 31.5 bounds 31, okay? So 31 is going to fall between 8.5 and 31.5. And we keep going. We keep doing the same thing for the next row. So then this upper class boundary, so let me write this in blue because it's kind of hard to see in yellow. This is going to be 54.5. And then this is going to be from 54.5 to 77.5. And then the fourth class is going to go from 77.5 to 100.5. And then to figure out the last upper class boundary, again, notice that your class width has to be 23. So if I take 100.5 and add 23, it's going to give me that last upper class limit, which is going to be 123.5. Okay, so these boundaries, this lower class boundary and this upper class boundary, is what you actually label on the x-axis. So here I'm going to start and I'm going to call this 8.5. Okay, and it's going to go, well, hold on, let me make it a little bit more to scale. Okay, and so now I've got 8.5 up to 31.5, and then 31.5 to 54.5, and then I've got 54.5 to 77.5, and then 77.5 to 100.5, and then 100.5 to 123.5. So now I have the labels on my axis, and then I can start graphing my frequency. So how many students completed between 8.5 and 31.5 credit hours? So that's 15. So I can graph the frequency here up to 15. Okay, all right. And then how many students completed between 31 and 54, 31.5 and 54.5? Well, that's also 15. Okay, and then we're gonna graph 13. So 13 is somewhere here. Okay, and then 4, so 4 is somewhere here. And then 6, which is just a little bit above this. Okay. All right, so there's my histogram where I've graphed the frequency. So I hope that you can see that the class width, so each bar, each frequency bar has the same width. And then notice that my class boundaries bound my actual classes. So then when I take a look at the data, right, I can see that 9 falls between 8.5 and 31.5. And so I don't have 9 falling on one of my boundaries. Okay. In the next video, I'll show you how to create a relative frequency table and then how to translate that into a histogram.